The wrench slipped from my greasy fingers and clattered against the concrete floor of my garage, the metallic echo bouncing off oil-stained walls like a gunshot in the early morning silence. I'd been under the hood of Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick for the better part of an hour, but my mind wasn't on spark plugs or transmission fluid. It was on the sound drifting through the thin walls separating my workspace from our kitchen, Clara's laughter, bright and musical in a way I hadn't heard in years, not directed at me anyway. I wiped my hands on a rag that had seen better decades and crept closer to the door connecting the garage to our house. Through the crack, I could see Clara pacing the kitchen tiles in her silk robe, phone pressed to her ear like it contained the secrets of the universe. Her face was illuminated by something more than the morning sun streaming through our bay window. There was a glow there, an animation I'd forgotten she possessed. "Oh, Rafe," she giggled, twirling a strand of her auburn hair around her finger. "You always know exactly what to say." Rafe Turner. The name hit me like a sledgehammer to the gut. Clara's college boyfriend. The golden boy who'd swept her off her feet 22 years ago before vanishing into the wind when real life got too complicated. The same Rafe Turner who'd apparently materialized back into our lives as the new project partner at Meridian Tech, where Clara worked as a senior project manager. "It's just work," she'd told me 3 weeks ago when she'd mentioned his name casually over dinner. "The company brought him in to handle the Morrison account. You remember Rafe, right? From college?" Remember him? How could I forget the guy Clara had compared every other man to for the first 5 years of our marriage? The phantom standard I'd never quite measured up to. No matter how many hours I worked, or how many bills I paid, or how many times I held her when she cried about her father's death. But that was ancient history. Water under the bridge. Clara had chosen me, married me, built a life with me in this creaking colonial on Maple Street in Ironworks City. We'd raised our daughter Tessa together, weathered financial storms and family crises and all the mundane disasters that come with 2 decades of marriage. Or so I'd thought. "I can't wait to see the presentation," Clara was saying, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "You've always been so brilliant at this stuff." I pressed my ear closer to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. In 20 years of marriage, Clara had never once called me brilliant. Competent, maybe. Reliable, sure. But brilliant? That word was apparently reserved for Rafe Turner. "Ethan's already left for work," she continued, glancing toward the garage with the casual dismissal of someone discussing the weather. "He gets up so early these days. Sometimes I think he's avoiding me." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, standing 3 feet away, invisible in my own home while my wife confided her marital insights to her ex-boyfriend. No, he doesn't suspect anything," Clara laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He's too focused on his cars to notice much of anything else." The words hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of marriage, and this was how she saw me? Some grease monkey too stupid to notice his own wife's emotional affair? I backed away from the door, my hands shaking with a combination of rage and humiliation. Through the kitchen window, I could see our neighbor, Mrs. Ballantyne, watering her prize-winning roses, her sharp eyes already fixed on our house like a hawk spotting prey. Nothing happened on Maple Street without Mrs. Ballantyne's knowledge, and I had no doubt she'd noticed Clara's recent changes. The early morning phone calls, the new wardrobe, the way she'd started doing her makeup before heading to early meetings. Clara's voice rose again, pulling my attention back to her conversation. "The Morrison project is just the beginning," she was saying, her tone breathless with excitement. "With your connections and my access to the client database, we could revolutionize how Meridian approaches enterprise solutions." Something cold settled in my stomach. Clara's access to client databases was strictly regulated. Confidential information protected by multiple layers of corporate security and legal agreements. The casual way she'd just offered to share it with Rafe sent alarm bells ringing in my mechanical brain. I'd always been good with systems, whether they were automotive or human. It came from years of diagnosing problems, following symptoms to their root causes, understanding how all the pieces fit together. And right now, every symptom was pointing to the same diagnosis. My marriage was falling apart, and Rafe Turner was the virus destroying it from within. Clara ended her call with a breathy, "See you soon," and I heard her footsteps heading toward the stairs. Probably to get ready for another early meeting that would stretch late into the evening. I waited until I heard the shower running upstairs before slipping into the kitchen. Clara's phone lay on the granite countertop, face down as always these days. The device that used to be as open as a book between us had become a fortress, guarded with new passwords and suspicious positioning. But I was a mechanic. I understood systems, including the ones people thought were secure. Clara's car keys hung on their usual hook by the back door. As the family's unofficial IT support and the guy who'd installed the GPS tracking system in both our vehicles for insurance purposes, I had access to more information than my wife realized. I grabbed my laptop from the kitchen desk and pulled up the telematics dashboard for Clara's Honda Accord. The GPS cache painted a very different picture than the working late at the office story I'd been fed for the past 3 weeks. Late-night routes to the Riverside Apartments complex. Multiple stops at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary. Lunch meetings at the Marriott downtown that stretched for 3 hours. None of these locations were anywhere near Meridian Tech's offices. I cross-referenced the timestamps with Clara's explanations. Tuesday night, she'd claimed to be in a client presentation until 10 p.m. According to the GPS, she'd been parked at Riverside Apartments from 8:30 to 11:45. Friday afternoon, she'd texted about an emergency strategy session. The GPS showed a cozy 2-hour lunch at Romano's, followed by a trip to Victoria's Secret at the mall. The evidence was damning, but it was also circumstantial. Maybe there were innocent explanations. Maybe Rafe lived at Riverside Apartments, and they really were working on legitimate projects. Maybe the lingerie purchase was meant to surprise me, but deep down I knew better. The shower upstairs shut off, and I quickly closed the laptop and returned to the garage. Through the connecting door, I heard Clara humming as she got ready, the same song she'd been singing in the shower when we were newlyweds. My phone buzzed with a text from my buddy Mick Sullivan, who owned Sullivan's Pub down on River Street. "Beer tonight? You look like you need it." Mick was an ex-cop with 25 years on the ironworks force before he'd retired to run the bar his father had left him. He had the kind of street-smart intuition that came from dealing with liars and cheaters for most of his adult life. Maybe it was time to get a professional opinion. I texted back, 7 p.m., and yeah, I definitely need it. Clara's heels clicked down the stairs, and she appeared in the garage doorway looking like $1 million. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves, her makeup was flawless, and she was wearing the navy dress I'd bought her for Christmas, the one she'd claimed was too fancy for work. "I'll be late again tonight," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "The Morrison presentation is tomorrow, and Rafe wants to run through it one more time." I'm sure he does, I thought, but what I said was, "No problem. I'll grab dinner with Mick." Something flickered across her face. Relief? Guilt? It was gone too quickly to analyze. "Great," she said, already turning away. "Don't wait up." She kissed my cheek with the mechanical precision of a woman going through the motions, her lips barely making contact with my skin. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her heels on the driveway. I watched through the garage window as she backed out of the driveway, her phone already pressed to her ear before she'd even reached the street. Mrs. Ballantyne watched too, her weathered face creased with the kind of knowing expression that made my stomach churn. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the garage floor where I stood surrounded by the tools and machinery that had defined my adult life. For 20 years, I'd built my identity around being the reliable one, the provider, the guy who fixed things when they broke. But some things, I was beginning to realize, couldn't be fixed with a wrench and elbow grease. Some things were broken by design. Sullivan's pub occupied the corner of River Street and Main like a stubborn old bulldog that refused to move for progress. The brick facade was weathered and scarred, the neon Budweiser sign in the window flickered intermittently, and the wooden door had been painted so many times you could probably carbon date the layers. But it was honest in a way that most places in ironworks weren't anymore. No pretensions, no corporate polish, just beer and truth in equal measure. Mick Sullivan stood behind the bar like he'd been carved from the same oak as the building itself. 6'2", gray-haired, with the kind of steady blue eyes that had seen everything twice and weren't impressed by any of it. He'd been pouring drinks and listening to sob stories for 5 years now, but the cop instincts never left. He could spot a lie from across the room and smell trouble before it walked through the door. Tonight, I was the trouble. "You look like hell warmed over," Mick said, sliding a Guinness across the scarred wooden bar without being asked. "What's eating you, Ford?" I took a long pull of the beer, letting the bitter foam coat my tongue while I figured out how to explain the slow-motion car wreck my marriage had become. The pub was mostly empty, a couple of regulars playing pool in the back, a middle-aged woman nursing a wine and scrolling through her phone, the usual Tuesday night crowd of people with nowhere else to be. "Clara's having an affair," I said finally, the words tasting like ashes in my mouth. Mick didn't react with surprise or sympathy. He just nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. "How long?" 3 weeks? Maybe a month. Hard to tell when it started exactly. "Who's the guy?" "Her ex-boyfriend from college. Just got hired as a partner at her company." Mick whistled low. "That's not a coincidence, my friend. Guys like that don't just randomly show up in married women's lives. They target them." The word target sent a chill down my spine. I'd been thinking of Rafe Turner as an opportunist, a guy who'd noticed Clara's availability and moved in for the kill. But Mick's law enforcement background gave him a different perspective on predatory behavior. "Tell me about the signs," Mick said, leaning against the bar with the patient attention of a man who'd taken thousands of statements over the years. I started with the obvious stuff. The late nights, the new clothes, the way Clara's whole demeanor had changed. But as I talked, I realized there were subtler patterns I'd been unconsciously cataloging. "She's got this ritual with her phone now," I said, "always face down on every surface. Used to be she'd leave it lying around, screen up, didn't matter if I saw her texts or emails. Now it's like Fort Knox." "That's classic," Mick nodded. "What else?" "She deletes messages while she's reading them. I'll walk into a room and she's smiling at her screen, but by the time I get close enough to see, she's already cleared whatever made her happy. Covering her tracks. Smart woman." "Too smart," I agreed. "But here's the thing that really gets me. Any mention of this guy's name, and she lights up like a Christmas tree. Her voice changes, her posture changes, even her pupils dilate. It's like watching someone transform into a different person." Mick poured himself a shot of Jameson and knocked it back thoughtfully. "You said you pulled her GPS data?" "Yeah. She's been lying about where she goes, how long she stays, who she's with. The digital trail tells a completely different story than what she's been feeding me." "But you haven't confronted her." "Not yet." I stared into my beer, watching the foam settle. Part of me keeps hoping I'm wrong, that there's some innocent explanation for all of this. And the other part? The other part wants to burn their whole world down. Mick refilled my glass without being asked. "Let me tell you something I learned in 25 years of police work. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. Your wife is showing you that she's capable of deception, betrayal, and putting her own desires above her family's well-being. That's not something that changes with a heart-to-heart conversation. So what do I do? Depends on what you want the outcome to be. You want to save your marriage? Probably too late for that, but couples counseling might help. You want to protect yourself legally and financially? Start documenting everything. You want revenge? Mick's eyes hardened. That's a different conversation entirely. The word revenge hung in the air between us like smoke from a cigarette. I'd been so focused on the pain and humiliation of Clara's betrayal that I hadn't really considered the possibility of fighting back. I was a mechanic, not a warrior. I fixed things. I didn't break them. But maybe it was time to learn. What would revenge look like? I asked. Mick glanced around the bar, making sure we couldn't be overheard. Depends on how deep you want to dig. This ex-boyfriend, what do you know about him? Just what Clara's told me over the years. Went to business school, worked in consulting, always had big dreams but never seemed to stick with anything long enough to make them real. Guys like that usually have skeletons. Financial problems, legal issues, professional failures they're trying to hide. If he's targeting married women in corporate positions, there's probably a pattern. The idea sent a chill through me. You think Clara isn't his first victim? I think guys who prey on married women for professional gain don't usually limit themselves to one target. And if he's got access to her company credentials, her client databases, her professional reputation, that's worth a lot more than just sex and emotional validation. The pieces started clicking together in my mind, like a complex engine finally finding its rhythm. Rafe's sudden appearance at Meridian Tech, Clara's casual mention of sharing client information, the way she'd been working late on projects that seemed to revolve entirely around his initiatives. You think he's using her for corporate espionage? I think he's using her for something, and it's probably not just her sparkling personality. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I finished my beer and stood up, feeling steadier than I had in weeks. For the first time since this nightmare started, I had a plan that went beyond passive observation and self-pity. I'm going to find out exactly who Rafe Turner really is, I said, and then I'm going to make sure Clara knows what she's really gotten herself into. Mick smiled, and for a moment I could see the cop he used to be. Now you're thinking like a detective instead of a victim. But be careful, Ford. Once you start pulling threads, you might not like what unravels. I left Sullivan's pub with a clear head and a dangerous sense of purpose. The drive home took me past Riverside Apartments, and I slowed down as I passed the complex. Clara's Honda was parked in the visitor section, just like the GPS had indicated on a dozen previous occasions. But tonight, instead of driving past in ignorant bliss, I pulled into the parking lot of the 24-hour diner across the street and waited. At 11:23 p.m., Clara emerged from Building C, her hair slightly mussed and her lipstick gone. She was followed 30 seconds later by a tall man in an expensive suit, Rafe Turner, looking every inch the successful businessman he pretended to be. They stood by Clara's car for several minutes, talking in low voices. Even from a distance, their body language told the story of intimacy and conspiracy. When Rafe leaned down to kiss her goodbye, Clara melted into him with the kind of passion I hadn't seen from her in years. I took pictures with my phone, the digital evidence as damning as any smoking gun. But as I watched my wife drive away from her lover's apartment, I realized that catching them in the act was only the beginning. Mick was right. Guys like Rafe Turner usually had bigger plans than simple adultery. It was time to find out what those plans were, and then it was time to destroy them. The next morning, Clara was gone before I woke up. Another early meeting that probably involved room service and Egyptian cotton sheets. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter. Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. Love you. The casual cruelty of that love you made my coffee taste like battery acid. I called in sick to the garage for the first time in 3 years and spent the morning doing what I should have done weeks ago. Digital archaeology. If Rafe Turner was running a con on my wife, there would be traces of it in the electronic paper trail that defined modern life. I started with social media, but Rafe's online presence was surprisingly minimal. a LinkedIn profile that looked professionally curated, a Facebook account with privacy settings locked down tight, and a Twitter feed that hadn't been updated in 6 months. For a guy supposedly in the consulting business, he was remarkably invisible online. That was the first red flag. Legitimate business consultants lived and died by their digital reputations. They posted thought leadership articles, shared industry insights, networked aggressively across every platform. Rafe's online silence suggested either paranoia or a deliberate attempt to avoid scrutiny. I dug deeper, using some of the investigative techniques Mick had taught me over beers and war stories. Public records searches, business registration databases, court filings, the digital detritus that followed everyone through modern life. What I found made my blood run cold. Rafe Turner had filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago in Delaware. Not just personal bankruptcy. His consulting firm, Turner Strategic Solutions, had collapsed under a mountain of debt and client lawsuits. According to the court documents, he'd been accused of misappropriating client funds, breach of contract, and fraudulent billing practices. The bankruptcy had been discharged, but the professional damage was permanent. His business license had been revoked in 3 states, and he was facing an ongoing investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for securities fraud related to a tech startup that had imploded spectacularly. This wasn't just a guy down on his luck. This was a professional con artist with a history of targeting businesses and individuals for financial exploitation. And now he had access to Clara's corporate credentials, her client relationships, and her complete trust. I printed out everything I could find and spread it across the kitchen table like a detective building a murder board. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Rafe would target mid-level executives at technology companies, usually women with access to valuable information or decision-making authority. He'd romance them, gain their trust, and then leverage their corporate access for his own schemes. Clara wasn't his first victim. According to the court records, there had been at least 3 other women in similar positions at companies that had subsequently suffered data breaches or lost major contracts under suspicious circumstances. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. "Lunch meeting running long. Won't be home until late. Sorry." The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. According to her GPS, she was at the Marriott downtown. Again. I decided it was time for some direct observation. The Marriott's lobby was all marble and brass, the kind of corporate elegance designed to impress clients and intimidate competitors. I positioned myself behind a pillar with a clear view of the elevators and restaurant, nursing a overpriced coffee and pretending to read emails on my phone. At 3:15, Clara and Rafe emerged from the elevator bank, looking flushed and satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with business negotiations. Clara was carrying a manila folder thick with documents, and Rafe had his hand possessively on the small of her back. They sat at a corner table in the hotel restaurant, their heads bent together over the contents of the folder. Even from across the lobby, I could see Clara pointing out specific pages, explaining details with the animated enthusiasm she usually reserved for our daughter's school achievements. Whatever was in that folder, it was important enough to risk a public meeting. And from the way Rafe was photographing certain pages with his phone, it was information he wanted to preserve. I managed to get close enough to overhear fragments of their conversation as they prepared to leave. "Client database will give us everything we need for the Morrison approach," Clara was saying. "Perfect. And you're sure about the security protocols?" Rafe's voice was smooth and confident, the tone of a man who'd had this conversation before. "I've been there 8 years. I know exactly how to access the files without triggering audit flags." They kissed goodbye in the lobby, a lingering embrace that made my stomach churn. Then Clara headed back to her office, and Rafe walked toward the parking garage with the folder tucked under his arm like a trophy. I followed him. Rafe drove a leased BMW that probably cost more than I made in 6 months, Impressive for a guy who'd been bankrupt less than 2 years ago. He led me through downtown ironworks to a small office building on the industrial side of town, the kind of place that rented month to month to startups and shell companies. I watched from across the street as he disappeared into Suite 47, which according to the directory belonged to Turner Consulting Group. Apparently, Rafe had recycled his business name despite its toxic history. This was where the real work happened. Not in hotel rooms and romantic restaurants, but in a nondescript office where a professional con artist could analyze stolen corporate data and plan his next move. I spent the rest of the afternoon conducting surveillance, documenting Rafe's routine, and mapping out his operation. By evening, I had enough evidence to bury both him and Clara, if I wanted to destroy my marriage and send my wife to federal prison. But revenge, I was learning, was more complicated than simple destruction. The goal wasn't just to punish Clara and Rafe for their betrayal. The goal was to make them face the consequences of their choices in a way that would hurt them as much as they'd hurt me. And for that, I needed a more sophisticated plan. I drove home through the darkening streets of ironworks, past the abandoned factories and struggling businesses that defined my hometown's economic reality. Clara lived in a bubble of corporate success and middle-class comfort, insulated from the harsh truths that shaped most people's lives. It was time to pop that bubble. The house was dark when I arrived, which meant Clara was still working late with her partner in crime. I went straight to my laptop and began crafting the first phase of my revenge. If Rafe Turner wanted to play corporate espionage games with my wife's career, he was about to learn what happened when you underestimated a small-town mechanic with nothing left to lose. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my garage with a pot of coffee and a legal pad, sketching out a plan that would either save my marriage or destroy everyone involved. By dawn, I'd made my choice. The FBI field office in Albany was a 3-hour drive from ironworks, housed in a gray concrete building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate criminals and citizens equally. I'd called ahead and managed to get a meeting with Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in corporate fraud and cybercrime. Agent Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with short blonde hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made me understand why the FBI recruited her. She listened to my story with professional detachment, taking notes and asking pointed questions that revealed she already knew more about corporate espionage than I'd learned in weeks of research. "Rafe Turner," she said when I finished my presentation. "We've been tracking him for 18 months, ever since the Turner Strategic Solutions collapse. He's suspected in at least 6 cases of corporate data theft, but he's been careful to stay just inside the legal boundaries. What about the bankruptcy fraud?" "Under investigation, but these cases take time to build. The problem with guys like Turner is that they're smart enough to use intermediaries, like your wife, to do the actual illegal activities. He keeps his hands clean while his victims take the fall." The word victims hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything I'd discovered, part of me still wanted to believe Clara was a willing participant in whatever scheme Rafe was running. The alternative, that she was being manipulated by a professional con artist, was somehow worse. "What can you do?" I asked. Agent Walsh leaned back in her chair, studying me with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen too many desperate spouses looking for salvation. "Officially? Nothing yet. We need evidence of actual crimes, not just suspicious behavior and circumstantial connections." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, if your wife is accessing confidential corporate data and sharing it with Turner, she's committing federal crimes that could put her in prison for 10 years. If Turner is using that information for securities fraud or corporate espionage, we're looking at a major case that could take down multiple targets." She slid a business card across the desk. "If you can get us evidence of the actual data transfer, recordings, documents, electronic communications, we can move forward with an investigation. But you need to understand, once we start that process, there's no going back." Your wife will be facing federal charges unless she cooperates fully with our investigation. I pocketed the card, my hands shaking slightly. What would cooperation look like? Complete disclosure of everything she's shared with Turner. Testimony against him in court. Probably wearing a wire to record their conversations and document his criminal activities. And if she refuses, then she goes down with him. The drive back to Ironworks gave me 3 hours to wrestle with the implications of what I'd learned. The FBI wasn't interested in saving my marriage. They wanted to use Clara as bait to catch a bigger fish. And if she refused to cooperate, they'd prosecute her as a co-conspirator in whatever scheme Rafe was running. It was perfect revenge. Clara would have to choose between her lover and her freedom. Either way, she'd lose everything that mattered to her, her career, her reputation, her comfortable middle-class life. But it would also destroy our daughter's life, tear apart what remained of our family, and probably send the woman I'd loved for 20 years to federal prison. I was still wrestling with that moral calculus when I pulled into our driveway and saw Clara's car already there. It was only 4 p.m. She hadn't been home this early in weeks. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a glass of wine and a stack of legal documents. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking slightly as she turned pages. "We need to talk," she said, without looking up. My heart hammered against my ribs. Had she somehow learned about my FBI meeting? Did Rafe have contacts in law enforcement who'd warned him about the investigation? "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Clara finally looked up, and I saw something I hadn't seen in her eyes for months. Fear. "Rafe's in trouble," she said. "Big trouble. The SEC is investigating him for securities fraud, and they're looking into everyone he's been working with." I sat down across from her, fighting to keep the satisfaction out of my expression. "What kind of trouble?" "His previous company was involved in some kind of investment scam. Apparently, he's been under federal investigation for over a year, and now they're scrutinizing all his current business relationships." She pushed one of the documents toward me. It was a letter from Meridian Tech's legal department, informing Clara that she was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation into her professional relationship with Rafe Turner. "They're saying I may have violated company policy by sharing confidential information with an external consultant," Clara continued, her voice cracking. "Ethan, I could lose my job. I could lose everything." The irony was delicious. Clara was finally facing the consequences of her choices, and she was turning to me, the husband she'd been betraying for months, for comfort and support. "What exactly did you share with him?" I asked. Clara's eyes darted away from mine. "Just some client data, background information to help with the Morrison project, nothing that wasn't already semi-public." "Clara," I reached across the table and took her hand, surprised by how cold her skin felt. "I need you to tell me the truth. What did you really give him?" She broke down then, tears streaming down her face as the whole story came pouring out. The client database access, the proprietary research reports, the internal strategy documents that Rafe had claimed were necessary for their joint projects. "He said it was all legitimate," Clara sobbed. "He said we were building something together, a new kind of consulting partnership that would revolutionize how companies approach digital transformation." "And you believed him?" I wanted to believe him. God, Ethan, I wanted to believe that someone still saw potential in me, that I wasn't just a middle-aged project manager stuck in a dead-end job in a dying town. The raw honesty of her confession hit me harder than any lie could have. This wasn't just about sex or romance. It was about Clara's deep dissatisfaction with the life we'd built together, her desperate need to feel important and valued and special. And Rafe Turner had exploited those vulnerabilities with the precision of a surgeon. "What happens now?" I asked. "Meridian's lawyers want to meet with me tomorrow. They're talking about possible criminal charges if the SEC investigation finds evidence of intentional data theft." Clara wiped her eyes with a tissue. "Rafe says we should get married. He says if we're married, I can't be forced to testify against him. The audacity of it took my breath away. Rafe was so confident in his manipulation of Clara that he thought she'd divorce me and marry him to protect his criminal enterprise. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to think. Clara looked at me with something that might have been regret. I know I've been a terrible wife these past few months. I know I've hurt you and lied to you and put our family at risk. But I need to know, is there any chance you can forgive me? I stared at my wife across our kitchen table, surrounded by the domestic artifacts of our shared life. Tessa's honor roll certificates on the refrigerator, vacation photos from happier times, the coffee mug I'd bought Clara for our 15th anniversary that said, "World's Best Mom." In that moment, I had the power to save our marriage or destroy it forever. Clara was broken, desperate, and completely dependent on my mercy. If I chose forgiveness, she'd probably spend the rest of our marriage trying to make up for her betrayal. But forgiveness would also mean letting Rafe Turner escape justice. It would mean allowing him to move on to his next victim, his next scheme, his next devastating con game. I thought about Agent Walsh's business card in my wallet, about the choice Clara would face between her lover and her freedom, about the justice that could finally catch up with a man who'd built his life on exploiting vulnerable women. I forgive you, I said finally. But forgiveness doesn't mean there aren't consequences. I pulled out Agent Walsh's card and placed it on the table between us. Tomorrow, you're going to call this number. You're going to tell the FBI everything you've shared with Rafe Turner, and you're going to help them build a case that will put him in federal prison where he belongs. Clara stared at the card like it was a loaded weapon. And if I refuse? I met her eyes with a steady gaze that contained 20 years of accumulated resolve. Then you'll face those consequences alone. Clara made the call the next morning, her hands trembling as she dialed Agent Walsh's number. I sat beside her at our kitchen table, close enough to provide moral support, but far enough away to let her make her own choices. After 20 years of marriage, I'd learned that some decisions could only be made in solitude. The conversation was brief and professional. Agent Walsh arranged a meeting for that afternoon at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Albany, where Clara could make her initial statement without the intimidation factor of a federal building. She wants me to bring documentation, Clara said after hanging up. Everything I shared with Rafe, every communication we had about the projects. Do you still have access to your work files? For now, the administrative leave doesn't start until Monday. Clara's voice was hollow, drained of the animation that had defined her personality for the past month. Ethan, what if they arrest me? They won't arrest you if you cooperate fully. Agent Walsh made that clear. What I didn't tell Clara was that Agent Walsh had also made it clear that cooperation meant more than just providing documents. If the FBI was going to build a case against Rafe Turner, they'd need Clara to continue her relationship with him long enough to gather evidence of his criminal activities. That meant wearing a wire, recording their conversations, pretending to still be his willing accomplice while secretly working to destroy him. The drive to Albany was silent except for the radio and the occasional sniffle from Clara as she processed the magnitude of what she was about to do. I'd offered to come with her, but she'd insisted on facing the FBI alone, perhaps the first genuinely independent decision she'd made in months. While Clara was confessing her crimes to federal agents, I drove to Rafe's office building and conducted surveillance. His BMW was in the parking lot, which meant he was probably inside analyzing whatever data Clara had provided in their most recent exchange. I wondered if he had any idea that his world was about to collapse. At 6 p.m., Clara called to say the meeting was over. Her voice sounded different, steadier, more resolved, like someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. They want me to wear a wire, she said, without preamble. Tomorrow night, when I meet with Rafe to discuss the Meridian situation. Are you going to do it? Do I have a choice? There's always a choice, Clara. But some choices have consequences you can't undo. She was quiet for a long moment. He never loved me, did he? This was all just a con game to get access to my company's data. What do you think? I think I've been the biggest fool in the history of marriage. I threw away 20 years with a good man for a fantasy that was never real. The admission should have felt like vindication, but instead, it just made me sad. Clara had paid a devastating price to learn what I'd known from the beginning, that Rafe Turner was a predator who specialized in exploiting women's vulnerabilities for his own gain. "Come home," I said. "We'll figure out the rest together." That evening, we sat in our living room like strangers trying to remember how to be married. Clara had changed out of her professional clothes into jeans and an old sweater, and without the armor of corporate success, she looked younger and more fragile than I'd seen her in years. "The FBI agent says Rafe has done this before," Clara said. "At least 6 other women in similar situations, all of them middle management at tech companies." "Did she tell you what happened to them?" 2 lost their jobs but avoided prosecution by cooperating with investigations. 1 went to prison for 18 months. The others... Clara's voice trailed off. "The others had their lives completely destroyed, divorced, bankrupted, professionally blacklisted." "That's not going to happen to you." "How can you be so sure?" I took her hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt despite everything that had happened between us. "Because you're not facing this alone. Whatever consequences come from your choices, we'll deal with them as a family." Clara started crying then. Not the desperate sobs of someone caught in a lie, but the quiet tears of someone finally allowing herself to grieve for what she'd lost. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered. "Maybe not. But you're getting it anyway." The next evening, Clara met with Agent Walsh to be fitted with a recording device, a tiny microphone and transmitter that would capture every word of her conversation with Rafe. The plan was simple. Clara would meet him at their usual restaurant, discuss the Meridian investigation, and try to get him to admit his role in the data theft scheme. I waited at home, pacing our living room and checking my phone every few minutes for updates. At 8:47 p.m., Clara texted, "It's done. Coming home." She walked through our front door an hour later, looking like she'd aged 10 years in a single evening. The recording device was gone, turned over to the FBI along with whatever evidence they'd managed to capture. "Did he confess?" I asked. "Better than that. He tried to convince me to destroy evidence and flee the country with him." Clara sat heavily on our couch, exhaustion written in every line of her body. "Agent Walsh says they have enough to arrest him tomorrow. How do you feel?" "Like I've been living in a nightmare for the past 2 months, and I'm finally waking up." The next morning, I was replacing the transmission in a 2018 Ford Focus when my phone buzzed with a news alert. "Federal agents arrest Ironworks man in corporate espionage case." The article was brief but damning. Rafe Turner had been charged with securities fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. If convicted, he faced up to 20 years in federal prison. Clara wasn't named in the article, but the reference to a cooperating witness from a local technology company made it clear that her role in the investigation would eventually become public knowledge. I drove home early to find Clara sitting at our kitchen table with a termination letter from Meridian Tech. Despite her cooperation with the FBI, the company had decided that her violation of confidentiality protocols was grounds for immediate dismissal. 20 years of my career. Gone, she said, staring at the letter like it was written in a foreign language. "You can find another job." "Not in this industry. Not with this kind of scandal attached to my name." Clara looked up at me with eyes that held a new understanding of consequences. "I'm 43 years old with a reputation for corporate espionage. Who's going to hire me now?" It was a fair question. Ironworks City wasn't exactly a hotbed of economic opportunity, and Clara's professional network had been built around the technology sector that would now view her as a security risk. But as I looked at my wife, really looked at her for the first time in months, I saw something that had been missing during her affair with Rafe Turner. I saw humility. I saw genuine remorse. I saw a woman who finally understood the real cost of her choices. "We'll figure it out," I said. "Together." 3 days later, Rafe Turner was denied bail and remanded to federal custody pending trial. According to Agent Walsh, the evidence Clara had helped them gather was so comprehensive that Turner's lawyers were already discussing a plea agreement. The man who had destroyed my marriage and nearly ruined my wife's life would spend the next decade in federal prison, branded as a convicted felon and professional con artist. It should have felt like complete victory. But as I watched Clara struggle with the aftermath of her choices, the professional exile, the social stigma, the knowledge that she'd been manipulated by a master predator, I realized that revenge was more complicated than simple justice. Clara had been punished for her betrayal. Rafe had been stopped from victimizing other women. The FBI had closed a major corporate espionage case. But our marriage was still broken, our family was still fractured, our future was still uncertain. Some victories, I was learning, felt a lot like defeats. The only difference was who was left standing when the smoke cleared.